I'm sure they're lovely people, but Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman are not your friends. Hi, I'm Rohan. I am a comedian and just general online potterer around person. And I also love to read, which is why it is very exciting for me to today be sitting down and having a conversation with the incredible Silvia Park, who is halfway across the world, but joining us in conversation about her book, Luminous, which, if you haven't read it, you absolutely should. It is a fascinating, sometimes uplifting, sometimes terrifying look at the future of humanity, especially a humanity that has integrated very, very heavily with cybernetics and robotics culture. And it is a book that asks a lot of questions about robot ethics and humanity and all of those things. So, Sylvia, thank you so much, A, for writing this lovely book, and also B, for joining us. I'm not going to start off with a heavy question. I just want to start off with a simple, easy question. Sylvia, what does it mean to be human?
So, such a light question.
I know.
I think, I don't know. Actually, at this point, I think it's getting harder and harder to ask what it means to be human. And I think it's because actually, when we look at history, we seem to spend so much effort into dehumanizing fellow humans. Like humans are obviously human, but and I actually think that with technology, we've gotten so much better at now seeing people as just pixels, as something that can be reduced to numbers, to things that are not real, that feel flat on the screen. So what's sad is that what does it mean to be human? It's a very subjective answer, a question, because I think that, even when we ask people who vote politically, sometimes they vote with with the assumption that they're essentially dehumanizing a certain group when they make certain choices. But then what they find out actually, if that person is their neighbor or their hairstylist or their friend, then that person becomes humanized to them. And that's why I think that question is just getting so tricky because we've decided that what is really human are just the people around us, the people that we can physically touch.
Right. Not in any way related to current events anywhere around the world, of course. Um, One of the things that's really beautiful to see in this book is this sort of there's everything seems to operate on a spectrum in Luminous, right? There's the humans at one end and there's the robots at the other end. But there's a lot of, it's not just a dichotomy. There's a fluidity to it. Like one of the main characters, June, is 78% cybernetic, but also a trans person. And then there's Morgan, who's a complete human, but is sort of, looking at a robot to fulfill all of her desires. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is, was like, how did you go about placing these people on this spectrum? And was that deliberate as a way to examine all these different people across this, what is now a spectrum of, well, humanity and cybernetics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when we think about it, we're all already cyborgs. Like so many of us actually, I'm pretty sure many of us when we wake up, our first temptation is to turn on our phone. And when you think about it, that means we're actually logging our brain onto a machine. That's our first instinct to engage our brain with a machine instead of, I don't know, say going to kiss a loved one or pet your dog. Like our first instinct is to engage with technology and to load ourselves. And that's why I think that, I started writing this book around the pandemic. And I feel like that was a period where people were so isolated, where a good chunk of the world were essentially trapped in these rooms and were incredibly lonely and isolated. And they found technology to be a life stream. Like it was a lifeline essentially to be able to connect with people. But what's so contradictory about technology is that it's both. It's both a blessing and a curse. And I really do fear that, that's why I wanted to portray a world where the robotics, it really depends on who's using it and how they use it, how they use that technology.
Do you, when you sort of explore it yourself, and obviously you went deep into it, is this something that you feel hopeful about, or are you, because one of the senses I get is just, one of the things you talked about is just how we sort of use technology to not just dehumanize others, but in some ways also dehumanize ourselves by outsourcing so much just emotional processing. Or this is why the character of Morgan is very fascinating to me, right? Because she creates her perfect quote unquote lover, and is still somehow just not at all satisfied by the end result of that. So where do you think we're heading in that space, where we live in a world now where people have AI chatbots that tell them everything that they need to hear or everything that they want to hear, but is that necessarily making us more fulfilled people?
No, is the simple answer I want to give. No, I'm a bit, I feel very down about the future these days. I think, especially because when I was actually writing the book, AI still felt really distant because this was around 2020, and AI still felt like, oh, it's like a program that can beat chess or beat, in this case, like most recently, Go. So it felt something that was very, very specialized in a way that didn't really encroach into our lives, which is why it's quite depressing actually that it has already enmeshed in our lives within the last 2 years. The way now people are using ChatGPT, I have friends who tell me that sometimes they log onto ChatGPT and then they ask their ChatGPT to say nice things to them. They
Oh
say
wow.
like, just like tell me like what are some good traits about me, like they just want that little pump up, and it for me, it reminds me of like the addictiveness that we felt with social media likes. When we start posting, we have like a quantifiable number for how much people like you, and we've become trained this way. I think a good like a most of our generations, like those older and younger, and definitely younger, are now being trained to quantify how desirable you are, how valuable you are as a person. And that's really quite frightening because then it means that you start to think that you can calculate, you can force other people to respond to you in that same way. And I worry that we're going to now start to really just yearn for interactions and relationships that are only entirely validating, that are not complicated or messy or deep. We just want something that's affirming.
Okay, just remember that you can follow myself and Sylvia on Instagram, where you can interact with us and tell us how much you like us. Another thing, since you did mention this, right, with these chatbots, etc., we're working so hard to make them, at the very least, imitation human, right? Where we want them to sound like real people talking to us. We want to feel like we're seeing an actual person talking to us. And then one of the disturbing things, like for me, one of the hardest things to read in the book was, and I'm assuming people watching this conversation have read the book without going into deep spoilers. There's this sequence in a warehouse that happens in the sort of late second half of the book that involves serious human on robot violence that was quite difficult to stomach. And how do you think we can address this, at least going forward, in terms of the future of robotics? Because on the one hand, we're going to want these robots to tell us all these lovely things, but I'm also terrified that we're going to use these very human like robots to remove some really horrific, just frustrations and horrible things on them. And how are we going to deal with that as a culture as this gets closer and closer?
Yes, I think we're entirely capable of that. I think that so when I first started doing research into artificial intelligence, again, it was really outdated in some ways, my research, because this technology is evolving, it's transforming, not in terms of advancement, but in terms of how we use it. Like that's what I realized within the last like 5 to 10 years. Because when I first did research on I was really struck by there was this case where essentially a bunch of, I think it was Interpol, it was a federal agency, was trying to tackle a pedophile ring. So it was child trafficking. So they created a little AI avatar of a young Southeast Asian girl who looked like she was like 7, and she was not real, but she looked very real. And they used this avatar essentially to lure in, and they ended up hooking, I think, like thousands of pedophiles. And so this was a use of AI that I thought was really fascinating. Like we are essentially creating this like sacrifice against like towards evil to absorb all that evil. And so I thought, okay, is that the direction we're heading towards? And that's why I wrote a lot about a lot of this violence. And I think some of the characters question themselves. They say, if this violence is directed towards robots, is that going to spare humans? Or alternatively, the question we may ask, because in some ways, a lot of the abuse I depicted against the robots is really mirrored and parallels with abuse against animals. And the way legally, especially the way I treated, the crimes committed against robots is treated with the same sort of callousness, same sort of like capitalistic worth value attached when an animal, like say that your beloved dog, tortured, killed, at most that person will get a fine because it's about property damage instead of a life. And so I was thinking about those things, but actually we know from history that and from research, sociopaths usually train themselves by harming animals
Right.
first in youth and in childhood, and they escalate. And so that was one of my concerns. What if instead, by creating like literally a sort of substitute where you can, as an outlet for our worst impulses, are we actually amplifying them? Are we saying that this is acceptable to be harming something that looks human but is not human? So really what makes it so different for us to differentiate between what is human, what isn't?
Yeah, right. That's one of those things that they're just because that was where when you were talking about this right now. When I was reading some of those sequences, that's where sort of I went in my head, where I'm like, what happens to the first person who decides that beating on a robot isn't enough? Right? It's no longer enough to sort of beat on something that looks human and wants to go there. So that's and since you mentioned your research into AI and how some of it became outdated, I wanted to know because to sort of take a quote from Alex Garland, this is a book that sort of happens in a world that is 10 seconds away. This is 10 seconds into the
Yeah.
future. So how did that research work? And when you're dealing with something like this, what is your process as a writer? Do you sort of build the world out and just the rules of the world and where things are in terms of AI and cybernetics, and then sort of plug the story into that? Or is it something that you have to build on the go? Because you get quite deep into just, there's the Imagine Friends network and the company and all of those things that's going on. So how does that world building happen in this case?
Well, it has to be fun. Otherwise, it's just torture.
Fair.
It's this question of why am I doing this? But I think for me, I started with the story. I started with characters. I think I was very interested because again, if we're imagining our world 10 seconds into the future, usually a lot of robot stories aren't about robots trying to kill us. Those robot stories tend to be more about what if robots solve loneliness? What if robots become our romantic partners? So we're already starting to see a lot of stories about that. But I was more interested in what if robots become family? What if robots end up integrating into our family? They can become our siblings, our children. They can become our partners. But usually, I would expect these robots. It's so interesting, right? It's such an intimate role,
Yeah.
and yet they're not equal. They are still a servant, and that's what I thought was be so interesting, and that kind of slipperiness. And I think actually one of the inspiration for that was I read an article, it was an essay on The Atlantic, and it was by a journalist who actually passed away about, I think, a couple months before that essay was released. And he was, I think he was Filipino, he was American, Filipino American. And the title of the essay is called My Family's Slave. And it's just this essay that delves into this immense, complicated love he had for his family's essentially slave. She was enslaved by his family. She was never paid her entire life. She was brought as a 19-year-old to America by his family and was like a mother to him, like raised him. And but it's just I think that kind of, that cognitive dissonance, right? Because he also could not believe that his own parents would do that to her. But to them it was normal. It was normalized, and to realize that this woman who was so important to him was never treated like she was human, actually. She was never given the dignity of being human. And so that was sort of a lot of the inspiration I thought about what will it be like for children to grow up with robots in their family? How are we socializing? What are we teaching our children when we now have these so-called artificial intelligence that are essentially there to be exploited since we're a young age?
That's actually, I think, quite fascinating from the Indian context as well, because we have well, at least analogous situations here in terms of how kids sometimes are raised or how people work for, I don't even want to say with, for families or for people. So that's quite fascinating. Since you did mention this piece in the Atlantic, I'd also like to know What was there other stuff that, well, a before Luminous ever happened, or while you were writing it, what other, just whether it was articles or works of art or movies, books, stuff that you read and inspired you while building this incredible world?
Yeah, yeah, I think that I've talked about this in other interviews, but this book originally began as a children's book.
Yes.
So
Tell me more
yes,
about
and
that, because because the thing is, in the book, if when you read the physical copy, that's in the author's note afterwards. And I remember finishing the book, and my first question when I read that line was, "But how?" Because I'm horrified by this. But how? So thank you for not traumatizing an entire generation of children. But I'm
yeah,
very curious to know more about that.
yeah, it's exactly that. I realize that I can't release this as a children's story. And it's because actually, I don't know if you felt this way, but quite a few people have told me that this book is essentially divided into an adult storyline and a children's storyline.
Yes, absolutely. There's the kids who have this very beautiful Stand By Me-ish arc almost, right? Where they
Yeah,
come together.
yeah,
And then there's all that other horrific stuff going on as well.
yes. But I had a couple people actually tell me that they felt that the children's storyline was darker.
Fair. I can see why they think that. That's fair. But it's so, to me, it didn't feel darker so much as, and I mean this completely as a compliment. It's sort of like reading how Stephen King writes children sometimes, where he
Yeah,
accepts that while they're innocent and all of those things, they also have complex internal worlds. And it doesn't matter what happens, you cannot sometimes protect their innocence from the brutality
yeah,
of their real life circumstances. And I love the way this book sort of leans into that. These kids, like all of them, have some pretty horrific stuff going on in their lives, but they meet it with a sort of, I think, equanimity and dignity that sometimes the adults in the book don't.
yeah. Yes, I think that was the difference between a children's book and an adult's book, which is that a children's book, somehow you do protect the children. The children grow in a children's story, but the story manages to protect, particularly their innocence, in a way that I feel, and I think that that's why a lot of children's books, when they do grow older, like where, for example, like the Narnia series and whatnot, when the children grow older, then you see that innocence being chipped away and
Right.
sometimes lost in sort of one sweep. But I think with this book, it was very difficult to protect the innocence because of the inherently really sad and hostile world that they live in, that they inhabit. And yet they manage to protect themselves, which is what you meant. They protect themselves not with ignorance, but with a kind of dignity.
Yep, absolutely. And while we're on the children's storyline, I'm very curious about the use of rabbits specifically. Rabbits are a theme that sort of
Yeah.
show up. Was that, I'm very curious about, like, is that, like, again, I'm sorry for a very basic question, but that like a metaphor for something, or is it's just really beautiful how the rabbits and the children are tied in together.
Yeah, yeah, I think that it's because, well, if I'm going to be writing about artificial intelligence and I'm writing about what is real and what is not real, really the source material for that, like the most influential story, a children's book actually, is Alice in Wonderland.
Yep.
Alice in Wonderland is a book that's about what is real, what is not real. And even though it makes so much play and fun out of it, Alice in Wonderland can actually be quite a dark story too. It's a and so the rabbit as sort of the portal to excavating what is real and not real, I felt like that just felt very suitable as among the animals I want to portray. And that's why in the book itself, I had a lot of fun, particularly with writing animals as robots versus robots as animals. And I think that's something that it shows the possibilities of robotics, but it also goes to show because in the book, a lot of the animals that reappear as robots are actually extinct animals.
Yep.
They've already died out. It goes to show also what are we really doing with this technology? Like why are we using this powerful technology to do something so, in a way, frivolous. It's actually to satisfy our vanity. And it reminds me of like, the way we now have these startups that are all about reviving extinct animals. And
Yeah.
and our reaction is why? Where are they going to live?
Are we in a
You
way ducking
destroyed
our
their
own
habitat.
absolution? Because that's another thing that sort of
Yeah.
comes up in this book, right? Where you're like, you don't have to feel guilty about destroying anything. if you can just come up with the robot equivalent of it. And that feels like a theme that repeats itself. Oh, it's okay if this person dies, I'll get a robot person. Oh, it's okay if I can't sort of be this person that can love somebody else, I'll make that. But was that something that you were thinking about a lot also?
Yeah, and I think it must really depend on the person, right? Because that's what I remember someone else asking me. They said that they felt like they were like, why did you portray robots as not bad? As in, why does it seem okay in this world to have robots? In fact, I think they were quite tempted. It sounded quite cool to have a robot. And and I'm sure it's going to be very cool. It's if we gave people a choice, if you could have a robot that would do take care of every domestic labor and it was cheaper than a car, I think a lot of people would feel tempted and they wouldn't find any reason not to turn that down. And I think that's why for me, when I want to portray this idea of robots integrating into our lives, I wasn't writing a creed. I'm not showing something black and white. I'm not writing this to say AI is evil or robots are evil. Rather, my goal was to really just ask questions, examine this from as many angles as possible, and see where there are probably going to be households and families that will love their robots like family. And then we'll see households and family that will treat these robots in horrible ways.
That is actually, and speaking of treating robots in a horrible way, again, one of the things that depressingly is unchanged all these years into the future is that um, a lot of the sort of sexualization and the violence against the robots
Yeah.
is very much still against the female robots, right? The Sakuras and the
Yeah.
Yunas, or the sort of children. And why are we still stuck in that loop even 50 years from now? Why have we just not learned basic empathy in the world of Luminous and possibly just in the world? Sorry, I'm just asking you to solve like a 2,000-year-old question on this call, but why not?
I don't know. I think that's why sometimes some of the characters ask, why don't we just give up? Let the robots take over.
Yeah, fair, because there's, Mr. Momo is like, Mr. Mo is just totally like, it's crazy to know that Andrew Tate is still alive and kicking in
Yeah.
50 years from now. Um, I'd also just like to shift for a second to talk about there's, aside from the robot side of things, there's also the political situation as portrayed in the books, right? You're talking about, and again, this is something that's just specifically interesting to me as an Indian and our geopolitical situation. There's the
Yeah.
sort of, we live in a world where sort of South Korea and the North have been reunified. And
Yeah.
how do you tread as a writer with what is obviously a very difficult and I imagine contentious, touchy subject? Like before you ever get to the robotics, how do you walk that line? Is it scary? Because I think you've done a great job with it, but what was it like?
Yes, I think writing about North Korea is very different as a Korean author than I suspect as an American or non-Korean author. Because writing about North Korea is writing about it's like writing about family. It's writing about your own blood. And there's so much more of a you're careful with it. You have to tread very carefully. On the other hand, I think it's also North Koreans themselves have been very fetishized, particularly in media and literature. That I think for me, what I was interested in is I wasn't interested in seeing them as a group as sort of like a particular symbol of suffering or oppression. I think I was much more interested in exploring these are essentially refugees. If we are imagining a reunified Korea where South Korea was the more dominant force, that probably means that South Korea, like we see with Germany, would absorb the North the way the West did with the East. And I imagine it would be even more extreme because the West and the East, they're sort of like their difference in terms of like their separation, their economic differences was not as extreme the way as we see it right now with South and North Korea. So if South Korea is to consume the North, that means essentially North Koreans are refugees in their own country. They're refugees in what now seems like a foreign land, and they have to assimilate. So that was the particular thing I wanted to examine. That's something that I felt was more penetrable for me. It was more relatable because we have so many diaspora or refugee, or we have people who feel the pressure of needing to erase who they are in order to belong. And
Right.
so that was my entry point for writing North Korean at
Okay.
that moment.
So there's sort of your entry points, and there's the things that you want to examine. Have there been reactions from readers, or where you're like, oh, that's interesting. That's not even something I was thinking about, but I can see how they've interpreted that or they've pulled that from the book. Has there been anything that's made you sort of go, oh,
Yeah, I think quite a few readers seem to think that. So, for example, June and Morgan are siblings. They're not very close.
no,
They don't like each other that
no?
much, and so they've described sort of they feel like there's some sort of literary parallel between their estrangement and the estrangement between North and South. And I was like, oh, I guess you could see that. Like,
Okay, how about that? So again, speaking of this thing, was there any sort of character that you would say is, a lot of people say, authors will have one character that's a self-insert or multiple characters that's a, is there any characters that you look at in this book and go, oh, that's Sylvia, that's me?
right, I should just pick the most horrendous character, like Mr. Mo,
And
and
yeah,
just say,
sure, 100%. That is 100% what I imagine, Sylvia. You walk around beating on people with a baseball bat and telling people how to be alphas. No, come on, give us a more honest answer.
I would say actually all four point of view characters came from me, like some slice or form. And yeah, it's really hard. I feel like they were all kind of folded from pieces of myself and the people around me. I will say, instead of like trying to figure out if a character is more related to me, the character that I found easiest to write, I found Morgan easiest to write. And I found her easy to write because she is very her storyline is very stupid. And
What?
I found that really
Poor
relatable
Morgan.
because I feel like a lot of her problems are like self-caused, they're self-inflicted, as opposed to like some of the other characters, many of their problems are unfortunate, like they have extraordinary problems. They had extraordinary things happen to them. Morgan's life is not that extraordinary. Her life is actually she herself is in some ways an extraordinary person, but she manages to use that to make very, very dumb mistakes that I think are quite relatable.
Fair enough. In that case, to sort of keep going with that is, and I'm sorry to ask you to speculate on the future of your own characters, but where do you think Stephen is now?
Oh, yes. Wherever he is growing very quickly.
All right, fantastic. That's good to know. I'm glad that there's hope for him. And in that same way, what is next for you, Sylvia Park? I believe that I was reading about a possible adaptation of Luminous as well. So, could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, yeah, I can just say that. So it was optioned by Media Res Studio, and so this was actually before it went out to publisher.
Okay.
And so far they've been really excited about it. They've attached, a writer, a director, and yeah, we'll see. We'll see where it
Oh,
goes.
yay! Fingers crossed.
But I'm pretty hands off about it. I think, whatever they want to do with it, it's their monster now.
Okay, fantastic. And what is next for you in that case?
For me, I'm writing now. I'm gonna work on a book. It's gonna be about mermaids.
Oh, wow! How about that? Okay, very cool. Not
Yes, the
robot
mermaids
mermaids,
are
just mermaids.
no, they're mermaids, but they're kind of like they're a bit like killer whales.
Okay.
So we treat them like animals, and I'm very interested in kind of exploring that from like a scientific perspective. A lot of it is also going to be about climate change, the way we destroy our Earth, kill a lot of animals. So it'll be kind of
Oh,
along that sort of
another
line.
hopeful book in the vein of Luminous. Love
Yes,
it.
yes.
And okay, as because it's such a great book and there's so many different tones and these things going on, I have to ask, this is slightly selfish question as well. What are your tips for just anybody who wants to write? And I don't mean that just what did you learn writing this book? And there's just anything you could say, not necessarily to make like their life easier, just this is going to happen, for example. Uh,
I learned to be really patient with the book, and because I feel sometimes people who want to be writers, I see a lot of impatience. Like there's a sort of urgency, this feeling like I need to get published now. And Instead, for me, I think this kind of like fixation on publishing means that you're already seeing your book as a product instead of seeing your book as essentially, say you spent your like 3 years or maybe even 5 years, 10 years to write a book, then that book now becomes a testament of you. It has taken up a big fraction of your life. And I think people should treat that with sort of the care and respect instead of already seeing it as a product because you don't have to do that. The world will do that for you. So your relation to the book, I want it, I think it should be kept with that, that sort of intimacy and really try to preserve that for as long as possible.
Okay, fantastic. And now, just as a person who has written about technology and essentially gone pretty deep into the way technology intertwines and affects with our lives, what tips do you have for people who use a ton of technology in our world? Should we all be going outside and touching a little bit more grass?
Yes, I think it's very hard to dispense advice about technology because so many of us will give advice but will not listen to our own advice. So I think I will say I've never really used ChatGPT. So I haven't been using chatbots. So I'm already like a fuddy-duddy and I'm probably gonna like fall out of the loop. It's quite scary because that AI is now becoming incredibly integrated into our lives. So I think that yes, we have to accept that it's going to be integrated because a lot of the forces, a lot of the ways that we interact with the world are not decided by ourselves, it's decided by bigger corporations. But when we allow them into our lives, I think we just have to be much more conscious of we're really just people of habits. What are you made up of? 90% is habits. And what are we devoting that time to? And if it's really just a screen, I think that's a real shame.
Ooh, and I mean, I'd just like to add to that as somebody who spends a lot of time on the internet. I'm sure they're lovely people, but Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman are not your friends. But no,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Sylvia, again for writing this fantastic, very thought provoking, sometimes brutal, sometimes hopeful, sometimes terrifying book. And thank you for chatting with us.